Also shows economic activity is slowing more than expected. Retail sales, industrial output, but also fixed asset investments, all missing forecasts in July. Joining us now, Sarah Hewen, Standard Chartered Chief Economist, Americas and Europe. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. We also had that University of Michigan sentiment, which disappointed on Friday. Are you expecting markets to correct a touch, or will this be short-lived?
I think that there is risk that we see a correction. That University of Michigan reading was pretty poor, as they reported themselves. It was the weakest since the drop that we saw last April, and before that we hadn't seen anything as weak since the Great Recession. I think another interesting factor is that it was weak across the board. It wasn't restricted to certain regions or ages or occupations. We did see a split between Democrat-leaning and Republican-leaning responses, but overall a very negative response to the onset of the Delta variant. I think if you look at the COVID case numbers, then it does give you cause for concern. If we go back a couple of weeks to where cases were and look at the trajectory for hospitalizations and for ICU admissions, it's a much worse trajectory than the same time
Sarah,
last autumn. Case numbers.
I mean, is that mainly a problem for emerging markets, or does it actually, change your view on some of, what the US could do, the UK could do, and other parts of Europe?
Well, the worry has been over emerging markets. We've seen some really terrible readings, and of course, places like Thailand, we're still seeing a negative impact on activity with the GDP data coming out weak in the second quarter, and case numbers still very bad there. On the other hand, I think if we look at countries like Malaysia, which have been suffering with very high COVID rates, they're improving now. They seem to be past the worst. We're more upbeat on the economic growth outlook there. And similarly for China, worries over the impact of COVID cases there, and reflected to an extent, I guess, in the July data that we had out overnight. But the COVID case numbers are declining, and we think that we're turning the corner there. By contrast, if you look at the situation in the US, I'm afraid that the concerns, I think, are only going to intensify because the Delta variant does seem to be so much more transmissible, potentially with damage not just to consumer confidence, as we saw on Friday, but to retail spending and broader sentiment across the economy.
Sarah, what's your take on China right now? So we had some pretty disappointing data. Can PBOC actually keep on top of it?
Yes, I mean, the July data came in a bit lower than expectations, but again, we think that because the pandemic situation is coming under control, case numbers are declining there, that the outlook for the second half of this year is going to be somewhat better. There's pent-up need for investment spending, so the weak fixed asset investment spending that we saw, I guess, was particularly on the real estate and side, but business investment we think is going to be recovering in the second half of this year. Similarly, retail sales, the unemployment rate that picked up, but that was something that we've seen seasonally in 2018 and 2019. So we're not too concerned about the employment trajectory. Probably not too much need for further easing, we think, at this stage from PBOC. We're expecting a cut to the required reserve ratio, and the jury is still out on what further moves the PBOC might need to take. But overall, we think that we won't need to see substantial easing, that the economy is likely to be improving from this point onwards.
Sarah, is there a data point in China that could actually, I don't know whether it hurts, consumption domestically, but also internationally, or is there a data point at which you're more worried about China?
Well, certainly the sort of retail side, the investment side, we would be concerned if we continue to see an ongoing deterioration. From an international point of view, of course, there are worries about supply chain impacts and the effect that could have on global inflation. So we're really looking at China with two different lenses here, the domestic side and the international impact for inflation from these supply chain disruptions.
Sarah, thanks so much. Sarah Hewen there, Standard Chartered Chief Economist, Americas and Europe, staying